What compels a young nobleman to forsake castles, titles, and comfort, to traverse thousands of miles, preaching the gospel in uncharted lands? The answer lies in the extraordinary life of Francis de Jasso y Azpilicueta, the young man from Navarre who would become Saint Francis Xavier, the greatest missionary in the modern history of the Church. Born in a fortified manor in 1506, this man of God carried the light of Christ from Europe to the far reaches of Asia, baptizing over 100,000 souls and paving the way for the gospel to resonate in India, Japan, and the islands of the Pacific. His life teaches us that true nobility resides not in family crests, but in responding generously to the divine call, even when that call leads us beyond all that is known. Chapter 1. Xavier Manor and the Early Years. In the mountains of Navarre, where the Pyrenees kiss the sky, stood Xavier Manor, home to one of the kingdom's oldest and most honorable families. There, on April 7th, 1506, Francis was born, the youngest child of Sir Juan de Jasso, President of the Royal Council, and Lady Maria de Azpilicueta y Xavier. The little boy grew up breathing the pure mountain air, running through the stone corridors of the ancestral manor, never imagining that God had destined him to traverse stormy seas and distant lands. His childhood unfolded amidst the devotions typical of a deeply Catholic family, and the studies befitting a young man of his lineage. The peace of those early years was shattered when Francis was barely 10 years old. Wars between Castile and Navarre rocked the kingdom, and the Jesuit Xavier family, loyal to the Navarrese kings, suffered terrible consequences. His father died when Francis was still a boy, leaving the family in a difficult situation. Two of his older brothers participated in the fighting, and the manor itself was partially destroyed by order of Cardinal Cisneros. The defensive towers fell, and with them, much of the family's power and fortune. Young Francis learned from an early age that earthly glories are fleeting, though he did not yet comprehend the plan that Providence had prepared for him. Despite the adversities, Lady Maria strove to give her youngest son the best possible education. Francis proved to be a brilliant student, gifted with a prodigious memory and a sharp intellect. His mother, a woman of unwavering faith, instilled in him a profound devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary and taught him to pray the Holy Rosary every day. In the manor's chapels, the boy learned to serve Holy Mass and to meditate on the mysteries of our redemption. However, alongside these seeds of holiness, there also grew in his heart the desire to restore the honor and fortune of his family, a yearning that would accompany him until his decisive encounter in Paris. When Francis turned 18, his mother made a decision that would change his destiny. She would send him to Paris, to the Sorbonne University, the center of learning in all of Europe. There, he could obtain the academic degrees that would allow him to attain important positions in the church or in court, thus recovering the lost prestige of the Xaviers. In 1525, the young man from Navarre embarked on the long journey to France, carrying with him his mother's dreams, the pride of his lineage, and, unknowingly, a heart that God would mold in an extraordinary way. The mountains of his childhood faded behind him, but the Lord was already preparing the encounter that would define his entire existence. His arrival in Paris represented for Francis entry into a completely new world. The city teemed with students from all nations, theological debates, humanist currents, and the intellectual effervescence of the Renaissance. Francis settled in St. Barbara's College, where he quickly stood out for his brilliance in philosophy and theology. He was handsome, athletic, excelled in jumping and running, and possessed that natural charm that attracts friendships. But alongside his virtues, he also cultivated the ambition to triumph, to make a name for himself, to achieve academic and ecclesiastical honors. He did not know that in that same college, sharing a room with him, would arrive an older man lame, of Basque origin like him, who would question all his dreams of worldly glory. Chapter 2. The Encounter with Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola arrived at St. Barbara's College in 1529, when Francis had already been in Paris for several years, cultivating his academic career. The contrast between the two men could not be greater. Francis was young, vital, ambitious, concerned about his future and his position in the world. Ignatius, 13 years older, had been a soldier, had experienced a radical conversion after being wounded in Pamplona, and now, in his 30s, he began his studies as the oldest student in the university. For Francis, that lame man who spoke constantly of God and service to Christ was initially annoying, even irritating. He did not understand how someone could voluntarily give up everything to follow such a radical ideal. Ignatius, however, had received from the Lord the gift of discerning spirits and the patience of a fisher of souls. He observed Francis with brotherly love, recognizing in that brilliant young man a precious instrument for the greater glory of God. For months, Ignatius worked on Francis's heart with a question that would resonate eternally in the history of the Church. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he loses his soul? This evangelical sentence, repeated with opportunity and charity, began to make an impression on the spirit of the young man from Navarre. At first, Francis rejected it with academic arguments, defending the legitimacy of seeking a worthy position in society and in the Church. But the word of God, spoken by Ignatius, acted silently within him. The friendship between the two countrymen was consolidated despite the initial resistance. Francis shared a room with Ignatius and with Peter Faber, a young Savoyard of humble origin but of luminous holiness. Peter had already done the spiritual exercises under the direction of Ignatius and had consecrated himself completely to divine service. Francis found himself in the midst of two men who lived for God, while he remained attached to his plans for earthly greatness. Providence had arranged this coexistence so that the ambitious young man could not escape the call that resonated in his conscience day and night. The conversations in that room at St. Barbara's College were true spiritual battles where the Holy Spirit fought to conquer a soul. The decisive moment arrived in 1533. Francis, after years of resistance, finally agreed to undertake the spiritual exercises under Ignatius's guidance. For 30 days, in silence and deep prayer, he meditated on the purpose of mankind, on sin, on divine mercy, on the life of Christ, and the call to follow him radically. It was a month of internal struggle, of tears, of spiritual consolations and desolations. He contemplated Christ crucified and understood that all the glory of the world is worthless compared to the love of God. He meditated on the eternal King who calls his followers to conquer the world for him, not with weapons of iron, but with the gospel. At the end of those exercises, Francis Xavier had died to himself, and a new man was born, an apostle willing to leave everything for Christ. Francis's conversion was complete and definitive. That young man who dreamed of academic honors and ecclesiastical positions now desired only one thing: to serve Christ without reservation, to go where no one had gone, to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. Ignatius had gained not only a disciple, but a brother in spirit and a future giant of evangelization. Francis wrote to his family communicating his decision to renounce any ecclesiastical benefit and to consecrate himself entirely to the service of God. His mother's response, although saddened by the distance this implied, was one of blessing. She had raised her son in the faith, and now that son was answering the highest calling, the seed planted in the manner of Xavier had germinated in Paris and would soon bear fruit in lands that no European imagined reaching. Chapter 3. The Birth of the Society of Jesus. On August 15th, 1534. The Feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. 7 men silently climbed the hill of Montmartre in Paris. Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, Peter Faber, Diego Lainez, Alfonso Salmeron, Nicolas Bobadilla, and Simon Rodriguez had chosen that Marian day to definitively consecrate their lives to God in the crypt of the Chapel of the Martyrs, where, according to tradition, Saint Denis, the first bishop of Paris, had been beheaded. Peter Faber, the only priest in the group, celebrated Holy Mass. At the moment of communion, each of the 7 pronounced their vows, promises of poverty, chastity, and to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to serve souls, or if this were not possible, to place themselves completely at the disposal of the Holy Father. It was the birth of what would become the Society of Jesus. Francis pronounced his vows with the fervor of one who has found the hidden treasure of the gospel. He was no longer the ambitious young man who arrived in Paris 9 years ago. He was a man transformed by grace, ready to go to martyrdom if God asked it. After Mass, the 7 companions spent the day in prayer and spiritual conversation, talking about how they would best serve Christ and his church. Ignatius had forged not only a friendship, but a brotherhood united by the fire of the Holy Spirit. Each of those men carried within them the same desire, the greater glory of God and the good of souls. Francis, with his youthful energy and his capacity for total dedication, already showed the traits of the great missionary he would become. The following years were of preparation and discernment. The companions completed their theological studies, were ordained priests, and waited for the opportune moment to travel to Jerusalem as they had promised. However, the wars between Venice and the Ottoman Empire made navigation to the Holy Land impossible. In 1537, understanding that God's will was different, they decided to go to Rome and make themselves available to Pope Paul III. The Holy Father received them with joy and entrusted them with various missions in Italy. Francis worked in hospitals, preached in public squares, catechized children and adults, always with that burning zeal that would characterize him throughout his life. But his heart longed for broader horizons, lands where the name of Christ had never been pronounced. In Rome, Ignatius and his companions drew up the constitutions of the new religious order that the Pope had officially approved in 1540 with the name Society of Jesus. Francis actively participated in these discussions, contributing his vision and his experience. The society would be distinguished by its 4th vow of special obedience to the Pope in matters of missions, its apostolic flexibility, its emphasis on intellectual and spiritual formation, and its availability to go to any part of the world where there were souls to save. They were true soldiers of Christ, but armed only with the cross, the sacraments, and the Word of God. Francis absorbed this spirituality with all his being, preparing himself without knowing it for the great adventure that was about to begin. Divine providence acted in silence. King John III of Portugal had requested the Pope to send missionaries to the newly discovered lands in the East. Initially, Ignatius designated another companion for this mission, but he fell seriously ill days before departure. Then, Ignatius looked at Francis and said simply, "Francis, this is your undertaking." There was no time for elaborate preparations, barely to collect some books and vestments. In a few hours, Francis left Rome and went to Lisbon, where the ship that would take him to India awaited him. Thus, in a manner almost improvised, humanly speaking, but perfectly orchestrated by God, began the most extraordinary missionary epic since the times of St. Paul. The vows of Montmartre were about to bear fruits that would exceed all the dreams of those 7 men. Did you know that Saint Francis Xavier is the patron saint of missions, along with Saint Therese of the Child Jesus? One conquered distant lands with his travels, the other, the whole world, from her convent with prayer. Leave us a comment and tell us if you already knew Saint Francis Xavier. Chapter 4. The Call to the Orient. When Francis Xavier arrived in Lisbon in March 1540, the city was the most important port in Europe, gateway to and from the Portuguese discoveries. Caravels constantly departed for Africa, Brazil, and the East Indies, carrying soldiers, merchants, and the promise of infinite riches. However, very few embarked carrying only the treasure of the gospel. King John III, a deeply Catholic monarch, had understood that the conquest of territories without the evangelization of souls was an empty victory. That is why he had requested the Pope to send Jesuit missionaries, and Providence had chosen Francis to open this path. The young man from Navarre would wait almost a year in Portugal, time he would use to preach, confess, and prepare spiritually for the greatest mission of his life. During his stay in Lisbon, Francis lived in utter poverty, rejecting the comfortable lodgings offered because of his status as a papal envoy. He preferred to sleep in hospitals, tending to the sick, catechizing the sailors and sex workers of the port, sharing the life of the most abandoned. King John III, upon learning of his holiness and apostolic zeal, wanted to appoint him bishop, or at least give him the title of apostolic nuncio, with all the corresponding honors. Francis humbly rejected everything, saying he had gone to the East as a missionary, not as a dignitary. He only accepted the title of apostolic legate, which would give him spiritual authority over the mission territories. This renunciation of honors would be a constant in his life, a living testament that his only ambition was to save souls for Christ. On April 7th, 1541, his 35th birthday, Francis Xavier finally embarked on the ship Santiago, bound for India. The ship carried the new Portuguese governor, Martin Alfonso de Sousa, with his entire retinue, soldiers, merchants, and 2 other priests who would accompany Francis, Father Paul of Camerino and Father Micah Paul, an elderly Italian. Francis boarded carrying only a breviary, some pious books, and the clothes on his back. He carried no gold or silver, had no special provisions, trusting completely in divine providence. As the ship sailed away from the Portuguese coast, Francis gazed at the horizon with a burning heart, knowing he might never see Europe again, but also knowing that he carried the greatest treasure with him, the Catholic faith, which he was to plant in pagan lands. The voyage to India would be a true test of physical and spiritual endurance. The route followed the African coast to the Cape of Good Hope, then across the Indian Ocean to Goa. The most optimistic estimates spoke of 6 months of navigation, but sea conditions, storms, and diseases could double that time. Francis transformed the ship into a walking mission. Each day he celebrated Mass when possible, preached on deck, catechized the sailors, and tended to the sick, who were many on those terrible voyages. His charity knew no limits. He cleaned the sores of the most repulsive, comforted the dying, and forgave those who offended him. The rough sailors, accustomed to a life of blasphemy and vice, were amazed at this priest who treated them with such love. During the crossing, Francis fell seriously ill several times, but he never stopped serving others. In moments of storm, when everyone feared shipwreck, he remained on deck encouraging the terrified, praying aloud, trusting in God's protection. They passed through Mozambique, where the ship had to stop for several months for repairs. There, Francis evangelized the African slaves, taught them prayers in their own language, baptized them, and comforted them. He understood that the mission would not begin upon arrival in India, but had begun the day he boarded the ship. Every soul he encountered along the way was an opportunity to sow the gospel. When finally, 13 months after leaving Lisbon, the ship sighted the coast of Goa on May 6, 1542, Francis had already won hundreds of souls for Christ, and had understood that his vocation was to be an apostle of the forgotten, of those no one wanted, of those who were farthest from God. Chapter 5. The voyage to India. The arrival in Goa was a clash of realities that would profoundly mark Francis's heart. The city, capital of the Portuguese state of India, presented itself from the sea as a European enclave in exotic lands, churches with bell towers, imposing fortresses, stone houses in the Portuguese style. However, Francis would soon discover that behind this Christian facade hid a very different reality. Most of the Portuguese who inhabited Goa had gone there in search of fortune, not holiness. They lived in concubinage with Indian women, practiced usury, exploited the natives, and gave constant scandal with their vices. The few priests who were there were more concerned with accumulating ecclesiastical benefits than with evangelizing. Francis immediately understood that his mission would begin not only with the pagans, but also with the baptized who lived as pagans. The Bishop of Goa, Jonathan of Albuquerque, received Francis with joy, recognizing in him the true missionary that land so needed. He offered him lodging in the episcopal palace, but Francis, faithful to his spirit of poverty, preferred to live in the hospital for the sick. There he spent his days tending to the dying, many of them abandoned sailors who had arrived sick with scurvy, tropical fevers, and other terrible ailments. At night, he slept on the floor next to the most seriously ill, so he could attend to them if necessary. His heroic charity soon became famous throughout the city. The Portuguese, ashamed by the contrast between their worldly life and the holiness of this priest, began to approach him to confess and change their lives. Francis spent hours in the confessional, reconciling sinners with God, restoring marriages, convincing concubines to marry sacramentally. But Francis's heart burned for those who had never known Christ. In Goa lived communities of converted fishermen, called paravas, who had been baptized years ago by Portuguese priests, but who barely knew the basic truths of the faith. They lived in poor villages south of Goa, on the fishery coast, forgotten by all. Francis decided to go to them, and in September 1542, just 4 months after arriving in India, he undertook the journey to those abandoned communities. He walked barefoot under the scorching sun, carrying only his black cassock, a crucifix, a breviary, and a bell that he rang to gather people. He carried no interpreter. He did not speak the Tamil language, but he carried the love of Christ and the determination to learn what was necessary to communicate that love. Francis's first task was to learn the basic prayers in the Tamil language. With the help of interpreters, he translated the Creed, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Commandments, and the fundamental truths of the faith. He wrote them in the form of simple verses so that people could memorize them easily. Then he would walk through the villages ringing his bell. When the people gathered, adults and children, Francis taught them to sing those prayers. His method was simple but effective: constant repetition, singing, gestures, stories of the life of Christ adapted to their understanding. The children learned quickly and became his best catechists, teaching their parents and grandparents. In just a few months, entire communities that barely knew the Lord's Prayer now understood the principal mysteries of the Catholic faith. Francis lived among those poor fishermen as one of them, sharing their simple food, sleeping in straw huts, enduring the suffocating heat and the torrential monsoon rains. He baptized the pagans who still remained, prepared the children for their first communion, sacramentally married couples, and visited the sick. His day began before dawn, with prayer and mass, and ended late at night, after catechizing all day. Miracles began to accompany his preaching. The sick were healed, the dead were raised. Extraordinary conversions took place. But Francis always attributed these wonders to the faith of the people and to the mercy of God, never to his own merits. For 3 years, he traveled the fishery coast, founding 30 solid Christian communities. baptizing thousands of people and leaving well-trained native catechists. He had found his true calling, to be an apostle to the poorest, to the forgotten, to those who didn't matter to the world, but were precious treasures to God. Chapter 6. Goa and the First Missions. After 3 years evangelizing the fishery coast, Francis returned briefly to Goa in 1545, not to rest, but to better organize the missionary work that was growing rapidly. The fame of his massive conversions and the wonders that accompanied his preaching had reached every corner of the Portuguese Empire in the East. Many young Portuguese men, touched by his example, approached him, asking to join the Society of Jesus, to dedicate themselves to the missions as well. Francis received them with joy, formed them spiritually, and sent them to continue the work in the villages he had evangelized. He understood that one man alone, no matter how holy, could not care for all the souls who cried out to know Christ. He needed collaborators, and God was sending them to him. In Goa, Francis founded St. Paul's College, which would become the training center for missionaries throughout Asia. Their future evangelists were spiritually prepared, native languages were studied, and catechisms adapted to each culture were developed. Francis personally supervised the training, insisting that missionaries must be men of deep prayer, of constant mortification, and of heroic charity. It was not enough to know theology. They had to be saints, willing to give their lives for the sheep. He himself set the example, sleeping only 4 hours each night, spending long hours in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament, performing rigorous penances. The young Jesuits who arrived from Europe were astonished to find in the East this giant of holiness who lived what he preached. During this period in Goa, Francis also bravely confronted the abuses that the Portuguese colonizers committed against the natives. He wrote harsh letters to King John III, denouncing unjust slavery, the exploitation of the poor, the corruption of officials, and the bad example given by many Christians. He was not afraid to confront the powerful when it came to defending the weak and protecting the good name of the Catholic faith. He preached in the churches of Goa with the voice of a prophet, calling for conversion, denouncing public sins, exhorting the Portuguese to live according to the gospel they professed. Many were converted thanks to his frank preaching. Others hated him for telling them uncomfortable truths. But Francis did not seek popularity, but the salvation of souls. During one of his stays in Goa, Francis met a young Japanese man named Anjiro, who had fled his country after committing a crime. This chance encounter was actually a providential arrangement that would open the doors of Japan to Christianity. Anjiro told Francis about his homeland, a powerful and cultured empire in the islands of the Far East, where no one had ever preached the gospel. He described an intelligent, disciplined, honor-loving people, but completely ignorant of Christ. Upon hearing this, Francis's missionary heart was ignited. If there was a people who did not know Christ, that is where he should go. He immediately began to prepare for this new undertaking, studying what Anjiro told him about Japanese customs, baptizing the young Japanese man with the name Paul of Saint Faith, and making him his interpreter and collaborator. Before leaving for Japan, Francis made a missionary expedition to the Malacca Peninsula, an important commercial port in the strait that connects the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. There, he preached with his usual zeal, baptized hundreds of pagans, and established a solid Christian community. He also visited Maluku, the Spice Islands, where the Portuguese maintained commercial fortresses. In those remote islands, Francis found small groups of abandoned Christians, without priests, without sacraments, mixing Catholic practices with pagan superstitions. He spent months with them, reorganizing the communities, correcting errors, administering the sacraments. Wherever he went, he left the church well established, with trained catechists and fervent communities. But his mind was already in Japan, that mysterious land that called him with an insistent voice. Chapter 7. The Moluccas Islands and the Martyrdoms. The Moluccas Islands, lost in the sea between Celebes and New Guinea, were known in Europe as the Spice Islands for their valuable cloves, nutmeg, and other spices that were worth their weight in gold. The Portuguese had established commercial fortresses there, but evangelization was practically non-existent. Francis Xavier arrived in these islands in 1546, responding to the pleas of some Christians who lived there spiritually abandoned. The journey was dangerous, sailing in fragile boats between archipelagos populated by warring tribes, many of them cannibals and hostile to foreigners. But Francis knew no fear. When it came to bringing the gospel to souls in the Moluccas, Francis found a missionary field full of extraordinary challenges. The islands were inhabited by different tribes, each with its own language, its own customs, and its own beliefs. Some were Muslims, others animists, others practiced mixed cults. The Portuguese who lived there had adapted to local customs, taking multiple wives and living lives completely divorced from Christian morality. Francis began his work, as he always did, by tending to the most abandoned, the slaves, the lepers, the dying. He would travel through the native villages on foot, under the equatorial sun, exposing himself to fevers, poisonous snakes, and attacks from hostile natives. His only shield was his unwavering faith in divine protection. During his time in the Moluccas, Francis faced life-threatening situations that tested his reliance on providence. On one occasion, while sailing between islands, his boat was attacked by Malay pirates who planned to kill everyone. Francis stood at the bow of the ship, raised his crucifix, and began to pray aloud. The pirates, inexplicably, turned around and fled, as if they had seen something terrifying. The sailors were convinced that they had witnessed a miracle. On another occasion, a terrible storm threatened to sink his ship. Francis threw his blessed crucifix into the sea while invoking the name of Jesus. The waters calmed immediately, and the next day the crucifix appeared on the beach, carried by the waves. This prodigy was witnessed by many and greatly strengthened the faith of the new converts. The work of evangelization in the Moluccas bore abundant fruit despite the difficulties. Francis baptized thousands of natives, established Christian communities on the main islands, and trained local catechists who would continue his work. His method was always the same: learn the prayers in the local language, teach them by singing, tell the stories of the gospel in a simple way, administer the sacraments, and leave behind a solid community structure. He did not impose the faith by force, nor did he use the Portuguese political power to make superficial mass conversions. Each baptism was preceded by serious catechesis. Each convert understood what it meant to be a Christian. This insistence on quality rather than quantity ensured that the communities founded by Francis would remain faithful to Christ even in the midst of persecutions. In the Moluccas, Francis also had to console the martyrs of the faith. The native Christians who converted were frequently persecuted by their own families and tribes. Some were tortured, others banished. Several died for refusing to renounce Christ. Francis visited these confessors of the faith, strengthened them with the sacraments, prayed with them, and reminded them that suffering for Christ was the greatest honor. He himself desired martyrdom. He asked for it constantly in his prayers. But God had other plans for his servant. He was to continue sowing the gospel in ever more distant lands. After 15 months in the Moluccas, having firmly established the church and having left priests and catechists to continue the work, Francis returned to Malacca. His heart was already flying towards Japan, the mission that would be the most difficult and glorious of his entire apostolic life. Chapter 8. Japan. Land of the Rising Sun, on August 15, 1549, the feast of the Assumption of Our Lady. Francis Xavier landed in Kagoshima, the hometown of his Japanese companion, Paul of Santa Fe. He was the first Catholic missionary to set foot in the Empire of the Rising Sun. Japan represented a completely different challenge from everything Francis had faced in India or the Moluccas. It was not a matter of primitive tribes or poor fishermen, but of an ancient, refined civilization with a complex culture, a strict code of honor, and deeply rooted religions such as Buddhism and Shintoism. Francis immediately understood that he could not use the simple methods that worked with the Pauravas here. He needed to adapt his approach without compromising the truth of the gospel. The first months in Kagoshima were of learning and humility. Francis dedicated himself to studying the Japanese language, one of the most difficult in the world. With the help of Paul of Santa Fe, he attended Buddhist ceremonies to better understand the beliefs of the people, conversed with the bonze monks, trying to find points of contact for dialogue. Paul's family received them with hospitality, and soon several dozen people converted and were baptized. But Francis realized that to truly evangelize Japan, he needed to reach the feudal lords, the daimyos, who controlled each region. Without their permission, preaching was impossible. With their support, thousands could convert. This political reality forced Francis to develop a more sophisticated missionary strategy. He then decided to travel to Miyako, the imperial capital, to obtain permission from the emperor to preach freely throughout Japan. The journey was an epic of suffering. Francis and his two Jesuit companions, Father Cosmas of Torres and Brother John Fernandez, crossed the country in the dead of winter, walking barefoot on snowy roads, sleeping outdoors, enduring hunger and cold. They wore their poor torn cassocks, a crucifix, and some books. The Japanese who saw them pass mocked those ragged foreigners who claimed to teach religion. When they finally arrived in Miyako, they discovered that the emperor was only a ceremonial figure without real power, and that the city was plunged into civil wars. They could not even be received in audience. The trip seemed like a complete failure, but from failures, God brings forth his victories. Francis understood that he had made a strategic error by presenting himself as a poor missionary. The Japanese, who greatly valued appearances and social rank, could not take seriously someone who looked like a beggar. He then returned to a Portuguese ship, dressed in clothes worthy of a papal ambassador, prepared valuable gifts that the merchants lent him, and presented himself to the daimyo of Yamaguchi as a representative of the Pope and the King of Portugal. The feudal lord, impressed by Francis's dignity and by the gifts he brought, granted him permission to preach in his domains and even assigned him an abandoned Buddhist temple to use as a church. Francis had learned that adapting to the culture did not mean betraying the gospel, but presenting it in a way that it could be heard. In Yamaguchi and then in Bungo, Francis preached for almost 2 years with extraordinary results. The Japanese, upon hearing the truths of the Catholic faith explained with clarity and respect, were fascinated. Many samurai, Buddhist monks, and even daimyos converted to Christianity. Francis participated in public debates with the most learned bonzes, defending the faith with profound philosophical arguments. The Japanese admired his intelligence, his sincerity, his holy life. The conversions multiplied, and before departing, Francis established fervent Christian communities that would face decades of terrible persecution without apostatizing. When Francis left Japan in November 1551, he had planted a seed that would bear fruits of holiness and martyrdom. The martyrs of Japan, canonized centuries later, would be the testimony that the gospel preached by Francis had taken deep root in that land of the rising sun. Chapter 9. The China Dream. When Francis Xavier departed from Japan in November 1551, he carried in his heart a dream that consumed him: to evangelize China, the most vast and populous empire in the world. During his stay in Japan, the Japanese Christians had explained to him that all their culture, writing, and philosophy had came from China. If China converted to Christianity, Francis reasoned, the entire Orient would follow its example. The Chinese Empire was like a spring. If the spring were Christianized, all the rivers that flowed from it would also carry the waters of the gospel. This strategic vision and this ardent desire to bring Christ to that immense country became his last and greatest aspiration. But the Lord would allow this dream to be fulfilled only in eternity, not on earth. The return journey from Japan was treacherous. Francis was shipwrecked near the Chinese coast and lost almost all his belongings, saving only his breviary and some letters. He arrived exhausted in Malacca, where he briefly regained his strength before heading to Goa to organize the expedition to China. In India, he found that the missionary work had grown wonderfully during his absence. Hundreds of Jesuits were now working in different regions. Conversions were multiplying, and St. Paul's College was training new evangelizers. Francis spent some months attending to administrative matters, writing long letters to St. Ignatius, telling him about Japan and his plans for China, and preparing himself spiritually for what he sensed would be his last mission. Entry into China was extremely difficult. The empire was completely closed to foreigners, and any European who tried to enter without official authorization was executed. Portuguese merchants could only trade on a small island called San João, off the coast of Canton, and under very restrictive conditions. Francis understood the risks, but his love for souls was stronger than the fear of death. He decided to try to reach Canton, using his title of Apostolic Legate, to request an audience with the Chinese emperor. If this did not work, he was willing to enter clandestinely, disguised as a merchant. What mattered was to bring the gospel to that immense multitude living in the darkness of paganism. In April 1552, Francis departed from Goa for China for the last time. He was 46 years old, but his body was prematurely aged by the apostolic labors, the tropical diseases, the constant deprivations, and the rigorous penances. However, his spirit burned with the same fire as always. During the voyage, he wrote magnificent letters to his Jesuit brothers in Europe, exhorting them to come to the Orient, where the harvest was abundant, but the laborers were few. He described to them the wonders of evangelization in Asia, the millions of souls who were waiting to know Christ, the immense joy of baptizing pagans and seeing them become saints. His letters, full of apostolic fervor, would inspire entire generations of missionaries to follow in his footsteps. Francis arrived on the island of San João in August 1552. There, he waited for months, negotiating with Chinese merchants to smuggle him to the mainland. He had found a merchant who, for a considerable sum, agreed to transport him to Canton under the risk of being executed if they were discovered. Francis had obtained the money thanks to the generosity of Portuguese merchants who admired his holiness. Everything was prepared for the journey when the merchant, out of fear, backed out at the last moment. Francis was stranded on that deserted island, a few kilometers from China, seeing in the distance the coasts of the empire. He so longed to evangelize, but without being able to reach them. It was November. Winter was approaching, and his health began to deteriorate rapidly. Providence had decided that Francis would contemplate China from afar, as Moses contemplated the Promised Land without being able to enter. His mission on earth was coming to an end. Chapter 10. Death in Saint João. On the small island of Saint João, Francis Xavier waited with heroic patience for an opportunity to enter China, but his body, exhausted by 11 years of uninterrupted apostolic labors, began to give way. At the end of November 1552, he contracted violent fevers that completely prostrated him. The few Portuguese who were on the island took him to a miserable hut, the only dwelling available, where they laid him on sacks of pepper. There was no doctor, there were no medicines, there was hardly any food. Francis, the great missionary, who had baptized hundreds of thousands of people, who had traveled thousands of kilometers carrying the gospel, was now dying in the most absolute solitude and poverty, abandoned on a lost island, unable to fulfill his last dream of evangelizing China. During the first days of his illness, Francis maintained his lucidity and continued to pray the breviary. With a weak voice, a young Chinese Christian named Antonio attended him with devotion, being practically the only one who remained by his side. The Portuguese merchants, fearful of contagion and occupied with their businesses, visited him little. Francis did not complain. On the contrary, he thanked God for allowing him to die poor like Christ, without any earthly comfort. He received the last sacraments from the hands of the ship's captain, who was the only one who could give him communion. In his moments of consciousness, he constantly repeated the sweetest names of Jesus and Mary, pressing against his chest the crucifix that had accompanied him in all his missions. As the fevers increased, Francis went in and out of delirium. In his moments of lucidity, he asked to be taken to the beach so he could see China in the distance. He contemplated those distant coasts with tears in his eyes, offering to God his frustration of not being able to enter to evangelize that empire. He understood that the divine will was mysterious, that perhaps his sacrifice and of dying without fulfilling this dream would bear more fruit than if he had entered China. He offered his life, his labors, his sufferings for the future conversion of China and of the entire Orient. In his delirium, he spoke in the various languages he had learned: Tamil, Japanese, Malay, as if he were preaching to the multitudes he had evangelized. His mind wandered through all the lands where he had sown the gospel. On December 3rd, 1552, at dawn, after a night of agony, Francis opened his eyes for the last time. He pronounced with clarity the holy names of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Then, with a serenity that impressed Anthony, he surrendered his soul to God. He was 46 years, 4 months, and 26 days old. He had spent only 11 years on the missions, but in that time, he had personally baptized over 100,000 people, had traveled over 100,000 kilometers, had founded Christian communities in India, the Moluccas, and Japan, and had opened paths that other missionaries would follow for centuries. He died in utter poverty, in a dilapidated shack on a lost island, but rich in merits before God. His body was buried provisionally in Sanchuo, in a simple tomb, without any solemn ceremony. However, God would not allow his servant to be forgotten on that remote island. 2 months later, when they opened the tomb to move the body to Malacca, they discovered, to their amazement, that it was perfectly incorrupt, as if Francis had just died. The skin retained its natural color, the joints were flexible, there was no odor of putrefaction, but a gentle perfume. This prodigy confirmed the sanctity of the great missionary. The body was moved in solemn procession to Malacca, where it remained for several months exposed to the veneration of the faithful. Miracles began to multiply. The sick who touched the body healed instantly. The blind recovered their sight. The dying were raised. The fame of Francis's holiness spread throughout the East, confirming that this man had truly been an apostle of Christ. Finally, the incorrupt body was taken to Goa, where it remains to this day in the Basilica of Bom Jesus, a perpetual testimony to the sanctity of Saint Francis Xavier. Chapter 11. The Incorrupt Body and the Miracles. The news of Francis Xavier's death caused immense sorrow throughout Asia. The communities he had founded mourned their spiritual father. The Jesuits lost their great missionary pioneer. The poor and sick lost their most beloved protector. But the sadness turned to awe when news arrived of the incorrupt state of his body. In the tropical climate of the East, where the decay of corpses is rapid, finding a perfectly preserved body 2 months after burial was an evident miracle. The Church recognized in this prodigy a divine seal on the sanctity of Francis, a visible confirmation that this man had lived in intimate union with God. When the body arrived in Goa in March of 1554, the entire city came out to receive it in solemn procession. The coffin was opened publicly in the church, and thousands of people were able to witness the miracle of incorruption. Francis's face retained its serene expression. The beard had continued to grow slightly, as only happens in living bodies. The blood that flowed when they opened his chest to embalm him was liquid and red, like fresh blood. The doctors who examined the body were perplexed by a phenomenon that defied all natural laws. There was no scientific explanation for this perfect preservation. For several months, the body remained on display, and crowds came day and night to venerate him, to ask for his intercession, to touch relics with their clothes. The miracles worked through the intercession of Saint Francis Xavier began immediately after his death and continued to multiply over the years. In Goa, a woman blind from birth regained her sight upon touching the holy body. A child drowned in the river was resuscitated when his mother invoked the name of Francis. Terminally ill patients healed instantly when relics of the saint were applied. In Japan, Christians who kept letters written by Francis guarded them as treasures, and many miracles occurred upon touching those papers that his holy hands had written. In Europe, when the first relics of Francis arrived, the prodigies multiplied as well. Possessed people were freed, paralytics walked, the dying were resurrected. The Church began to carefully collect all these testimonies for the canonization process. The veneration of the incorrupt body of Saint Francis Xavier became one of the most popular devotions in the entire Catholic East. Every 10 years, the body was publicly displayed in Goa, and pilgrims from all over Asia came to venerate him. Even several centuries after his death, the body continued to show signs of incorruption that astonished scientists. In 1614, the right arm of Francis was separated, the arm with which he had baptized so many thousands, and was sent to Rome, where it is preserved in the Church of the Jesuit. In 1619, another arm was sent to Japan, the land that Francis had loved so much. These distinguished relics were the object of constant veneration and the occasion of countless miracles. The canonization process of Francis Xavier advanced with unusual rapidity due to the multitude of verified miracles and the unanimous testimony of holiness. He was beatified by Pope Paul V in 1619, only 67 years after his death. The canonization took place on March 12, 1622, when Pope Gregory XV elevated him to the altars along with Saint Ignatius of Loyola, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Isidore the Farmer, and Saint Philip Neri. The Church officially recognized that Francis Xavier had been one of the greatest missionaries in its entire history, worthy of being venerated and imitated by the faithful throughout the world. Pope Pius X proclaimed him patron saint of Catholic missions along with Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, thus uniting the traveling apostle with the Carmelite nun, the conqueror of distant lands with the contemplative who, from her convent, conquered the world with prayer. Today, more than 4 centuries after his death, Saint Francis Xavier remains the perfect model of the Catholic missionary, a man of deep prayer, of ardent apostolic zeal, of heroic charity, and of total abandonment in the will of God. Chapter 12. Prayer to Saint Francis Xavier. Glorious Saint Francis Xavier, tireless apostle of Christ in distant lands, you who left manners and honors to bring the gospel to the ends of the earth. Listen kindly to the supplications that we address to you with a confident heart. You who crossed stormy oceans with no more wealth than a crucifix and no more ambition than to win souls for Christ. Teach us to detach ourselves from fleeting possessions and to seek only the kingdom of God. You who mastered foreign tongues to speak of Jesus to those who didn't know him. Help us to communicate with charity and patience the faith we profess to all those around us. Saint Francis Xavier, patron saint of Catholic missions, you who with your own hands baptized over 100,000 souls, obtain for us from the Lord a truly missionary heart. May we not remain indifferent to the millions of our brothers and sisters who still do not know Christ. Stir up in our parishes, in our families, in our young people, generous missionary vocations to continue the work that you began. Because many priests, religious sisters, and dedicated lay people to respond with joy to the call to bring the gospel to the most remote and needy places in our world. You who in the midst of fevers and illnesses never cease to serve the poor and sick, intercede for all those who suffer ailments of body and soul, obtain for them health if it is conducive to their eternal salvation, and if not, obtain for them the grace to unite their sufferings to the cross of Christ. Be a special protector of the missionaries who work in difficult lands, of the catechists who teach the faith with sacrifice, of those who evangelize in the midst of persecutions and dangers. May none of them falter in their apostolic work, but may they persevere with the same fortitude that you showed until the last breath of your life. Saint Francis Xavier, you who died contemplating in the distance the coasts of China, without being able to enter and evangelize that empire, teach us to accept with serenity when God does not fulfill our projects as we had planned them. Help us to understand that our apparent failures, offered with love, can bear more fruit than our successes. You who lived in absolute poverty and died in a miserable shack, but rich in merits before God, deliver us from the slavery of material riches and from the eagerness to accumulate earthly goods. Teach us that true happiness is in serving Christ and in working for the salvation of souls. Glorious Saint Francis Xavier, whose incorrupt body remains to this day, as a testimony to your holiness, pray for us before the throne of God. Obtain for us a living faith that translates into works of charity, an apostolic zeal that impels us to share the treasure of our Catholic faith, and an absolute trust in divine providence that allows us to face with serenity all the trials of life, that one day at the end of our earthly pilgrimage we may meet you in heaven and praise together for all eternity the infinite mercy of God. Amen.